Good afternoon, everyone who's here at the moment. And I see we've got, in addition to people in Australia, which you kind of hope for, that we've got some people from Asia, at least I can see from Vietnam and India, and I think Hong Kong. So thank you for being here. Just give it a couple more minutes to make sure that people who've been waiting can get in, and then we'll begin shortly. So thank you for your patience. All right, well, we might as well begin now. I think there are still a few more people dribbling in, but can I welcome you to this webinar focused on yesterday's 2021 federal budget. Again, can I welcome people who are here from, I can see, across Australia, including some folks from Perth, as well as from Melbourne and Sydney. We've got a couple of people from Vietnam, one from India. I think we're getting some, if it's not too early for them, from Europe as well. So good afternoon for most of you. Good morning for those of you for whom it's morning. And thank you very much for joining me in this webinar looking at the 2021 federal budget. So I'm just going to begin by sharing my screen, which I can't see the button for that at the moment. Just forgive me while I get that up. Okay, there we are, the share screen button as always. Okay. So yes, here we go, talking about the 2021 federal budget that was brought down by Josh Frydenberg last night in Canberra. So Australia's economy has been doing much better over the past year than we had expected it to, and much better than most other comparable countries. Although we had our first recession in almost 30 years, like almost every other country in the world experienced a recession last year, ours was shallower than that of most other comparable countries, and we began to emerge from it earlier than most other comparable countries. So it's likely that when the March quarter GDP figures are released in just under 4 weeks' time, they'll show that in the March quarter we had regained our pre-pandemic level of real GDP, and with the exception of New Zealand that did that in the third quarter of last year, there aren't many others of whom that can be said as of the first quarter of 2021. We did experience quite a sharp reduction in employment, sharper than most of the countries shown in this chart with the exception of the United States, and like most other countries, we experienced a significant increase in the unemployment rate. The US had a much worse experience than other countries in regard to employment and unemployment because almost uniquely among advanced economies, it didn't have a furlough or wage subsidy scheme similar to our JobKeeper, but rather sought to alleviate the discomfort of those who found themselves losing their jobs by throwing much larger amounts of cash at them than was necessary or undertaken in countries that managed to minimise the loss of jobs. And of course, once JobKeeper did come into place in early May last year, it proved very effective, not only in preventing further job losses, but in fact in getting employers to take back some of the people that they laid off in the first weeks of the pandemic. So now, as of March of this year, Australia is, together with New Zealand, one of very few countries where the level of employment is actually higher than it was on the eve of the pandemic, where more people are working than was the case in the early months of 2020. And our unemployment rate is now down to at 5.6% in March, less than half a percentage point above it was before the pandemic hit. And there are, in simple terms, two reasons why we've done as well in the economy as we have. The first is, of course, as the Treasurer stressed both in his budget speech last night and in his address earlier today to the National Press Club, because we've been very successful in keeping the virus at bay. It's become clear, I think, that there never was any real trade-off between keeping the virus at bay and keeping the economy afloat, or as some people put it, between lives and livelihoods. Experience has shown that if you can't keep the virus at bay, you're either going to experience protracted or recurring lockdowns, or people will fear that they are just around the corner. And even in countries that have eschewed widespread lockdowns, such as Sweden, people have nonetheless voluntarily imposed all sorts of restrictions on themselves as to what they can do. I suspect moving forward, a much more important criterion for economic success will be the speed with which populations are vaccinated. And we're not doing nearly as well on that front as some other countries, including countries that didn't handle the first wave of the virus particularly well, are now doing. But for the time being, at least, the fact that Australians can go about a large proportion of what they would regard as normal activities to a much greater extent than people in Europe or the United States or some other emerging countries have been able to do, is an important part of the reasons for the good economic results that I showed earlier. And of course, the other reason is that Australia has done more than almost all other advanced economies by way of providing fiscal policy support to households and businesses through the pandemic. And looking at the chart on the right, which comes from the IMF's semi-annual fiscal monitor, it's worth discarding the areas that in those columns that are shown as shaded, because they refer to so-called below-the-line measures, that is loan guarantees and the acceptance of contingent liabilities, which don't necessarily involve the government spending cash or reducing taxes. If you look at the solid bars, you can see that Australia's fiscal support was larger as a proportion of GDP than all but three other countries, the US, New Zealand, and the UK. And of course, two of those, the US and the UK, did much worse than Australia did in managing the virus. So those two things, by and large, explain most of our relatively good economic performance over the last 12 months or so. So to turn to how the Treasury is seeing the outlook for the economy in framing the budget that was brought down last night. In these charts, the dots show the forecasts that were in the December mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, and the columns show the forecasts that were in the budget papers last night. As you can see, the Treasury has significantly revised up its forecasts for the 2021 financial year that's about to end, and for the 2021-22 financial year that begins on the 1st of July. It hasn't made nearly so significant revisions beyond that period. In fact, the forecast for economic growth in 2022-23 isn't changed at all, and the forecast for 2023-24 has actually been revised down marginally, although Treasury always disclaims a great deal of confidence in its forecasts for the last 2 years of any forward estimates period. You can also see in the bottom chart that there have been even more substantial upward revisions to the forecasts of nominal GDP growth in 2021 and 2021-22. That's important because the tax system actually taxes nominal GDP growth rather than real GDP growth, and those upward revisions to nominal GDP growth are the main reasons for the government being able to significantly revise upward its forecasted tax revenue. One of the things that drives the difference between growth in real GDP and nominal GDP is, of course, the trend in commodity prices and the fact that iron ore prices have been more than treble what had been assumed in both last October's budget and in the December mid-year economic and fiscal outlook is a big reason for those upward revisions to nominal GDP, and the apparent downward revision to nominal GDP growth in 2022-23 reflects the budget's very conservative assumption that the iron ore price will fall to $55 a tonne by the March quarter of next year, and of course flow through as a year average into that particular financial year. I guess we'll have to wait and see whether that assumption turns out to be as wide of the mark as the corresponding assumption in last year's budget did. Largely because economic growth has been stronger than expected, the government's been able to revise significantly upward its forecast for employment growth in the financial year that's about to end. That's now forecast to be more than 6% over the year to the June quarter, which is, of course, very much flattered by the fact that the June quarter last year was the one which saw the greatest extent of job losses. The government has actually revised slightly down its employment forecasts for 2021-22 and the following financial year, partly because the starting point is much better for the next financial year than it had assumed to have been. As you can see from the final chart there, the forecasts for unemployment are much better than they were even as recently as December. And whereas in December last year, the government was not expecting the unemployment rate to fall below 6% until the middle of 2024, it's now below that level already, and it's now forecasting that the unemployment rate will fall to 4.5% by the middle of 2024. And as the Treasurer said a number of times, apart from a brief period in the lead up to the financial crisis of 2008, we haven't had an unemployment rate of 4% or less for any length of time since the early days of Gough Whitlam's prime ministership in the early 1970s. On the other hand, while the outlook for employment and economic growth looks much better now than it did, say, 4 or 6 months ago, as the Reserve Bank has also noted, the outlook for what it calls the nominal economy, that is, wages and prices, haven't improved nearly as much. Indeed, the government's made only marginal upward revisions to its forecasts for wages growth in 2021-22 and 2022-23, and very small adjustments to its CPI forecasts for both of those years, although the CPI for the year to the June quarter that we're now in is expected to be over 3.5% because of the rise in petrol prices over the last 6 months, but more particularly because the things that contributed to a negative CPI in the June quarter last year will, of course, drop out of the annual rate calculation when we look at the June quarter 2021. But the point that is made by these forecasts and the very small revisions to them is the recognition by the Treasury and the Reserve Bank that having an economy with an unemployment rate of 5% is no longer sufficient to generate the sort of wages growth that is in turn necessary to have the underlying inflation rate back within the Reserve Bank's 2 to 3% target band. And that realization has been critical in the Treasurer's decision to put off for a later year the task of budget repair, that is, cutting spending and or raising taxes, with a view to putting the budget on a path back to surplus and paying down debt, which of course has been something that the coalition has attached a good deal of importance to for the best part of 20 years, but had to put aside last year in the face of the pandemic, which might have been politically difficult, but was absolutely the right thing to have done. Looking at those Treasury forecasts in a bit more detail now, we can see that the government's expecting the economic recovery to be sustained by strong growth in consumer spending in the coming financial year, which makes sense given the forecast strong growth in employment and the fact that households have accumulated a considerable volume of saving over the past year, in part because they haven't been able to spend all the money that governments have thrown at them. And the assumption, which seems quite realistic, is that they will reduce their saving ratio as the year unfolds towards a more normal level of maybe around 5 or 6%. Another important point, though the budget papers don't really mention it, is that Australians would normally be spending between $50 and $55 billion overseas each year, but they haven't been able to do that because Australia, almost uniquely, along with China, has decided that our chances of keeping a virus at bay are well served by locking us in for the duration, by preventing us from leaving. And that means that Australians have found themselves spending at least some, I think quite a significant proportion of that 55 billion a year that they'd preferred to have spent overseas, instead domestically on their own homes, in their own homes, on cars, clothing and things like that. And as it happens, although this isn't widely realised, the spending of a big chunk of what Australians would have preferred to spend overseas has more than offset the loss of spending from the foreigners, tourists, students and migrants who aren't allowed to come here for the duration of the pandemic. But once we get into 2022-23 and public spending, which has been very strong for 5 or 6 years, starts to slow, as it's expected to do, the government's assuming that business investment will take up the slack, and that in particular non-mining business investment will grow by more than 12% in 2022-23, although the overall growth in business investment will be dampened by a slower upturn in mining investment. In the meantime, the government's also assuming that the rebuilding of inventories will make a significant contribution to growth in the financial year that's about to end, although we won't expect too much from that in 2022-23. Another interesting aspect of the forecasts is that the government isn't expecting Australia's rather unusual recent experience of running current account surpluses to be sustained beyond the financial year that's about to begin. Of course, that largely reflects the assumption, as I mentioned before, that the iron ore price is going to fall from over $200 a tonne at the moment to $55 a tonne by the March quarter of next year, which is reflected in that very sharp deterioration in the terms of trade that you can see in the top right-hand corner. That's the ratio of the prices we get for our exports to the prices we pay for our imports. If the iron ore price does over the next year what it's done over the past year and defy those very conservative or cautious forecasts, then we might continue to run current account surpluses for a bit longer, although, of course, to the extent that the economy continues to recover. And if we do see a significant rise in business investment in plant and equipment, most of which is imported, then we'd expect to see stronger growth in imports, and that would tend to push the current account balance back towards deficit. One other very important assumption or set of forecasts in the budget, of course, relates to population growth. And as you can see, the government's now expecting net overseas migration to be negative for 2 years, almost minus 100,000 in the year that's about to end, and minus 75,000 in 2021. The government's then assuming, and it is an assumption, it's not a guarantee of the government's decision making with regard to our borders, it's assuming that after that net migration gradually picks up, and importantly that by 2024-25 immigration levels are back to where they have been on average since about 2005. Now that's actually quite an important policy question that I think is unresolved. And remember that in the years immediately prior to the pandemic, Peter Dutton, as immigration minister, among other things, or Home Affairs minister, had been cutting the permanent migration intake target from 190,000 per annum to 160,000, course, we get a lot more temporary migrants than that. And it may be that the government thinks it would be helpful to the objective of generating faster wages growth if we kept a tighter rein on temporary migrants to Australia than had been the case over the previous 10, 15, 20 years. So I wouldn't necessarily guarantee that the migration intake's going to turn around by quite as much as is shown in those forecasts, even if the assumptions they're making about the timing of the opening of our borders gradually turn out to be close to the mark. I actually think, reflecting on these forecasts, that the economy could in some respects do better than Treasury has assumed. For example, the forecasts for economic growth are appreciably below the Reserve Bank's forecasts for the current financial year and the next one that were published last Friday. And Treasury's been more cautious about the outlook for unemployment than the Reserve Bank was in its forecasts. The Reserve Bank has got the unemployment rate falling to 4.5% by December 2022. That's the end of next year. That's 18 months earlier than Treasury is assuming. So it's quite plausible that we could get a stronger performance for the real economy than Treasury has assumed. But whether that leads to faster growth in wages and prices is more a matter of conjecture. Despite being more bullish on economic growth, the Reserve Bank is actually less optimistic about a return to its target rate of inflation than the Treasury has been in framing this budget. As I say here, I think the forecast Treasury is making of strong growth in consumer spending over this year and 2021-22 is soundly based, although there might be some downside risk to the forecast of 12.5% growth in non-mining business investment in 2022-23. And I say that notwithstanding the very high level of business confidence that we saw reported in the NAB survey on Monday, and the tax incentives for investment that were extended in this budget, about which I'll say a bit more later on. And I've already mentioned, of course, the very conservative forecasts that the government has made with regard to iron ore prices that, if history's any guide, could well be exceeded over the course of this year. Let me turn now to look at the strategy in the budget. And the key point here is that the 2021-22 budget is unashamedly about securing economic recovery, in the Treasurer's phrase, and getting unemployment down, rather than returning abruptly to the pursuit of budget repair, which has been the coalition's goal for most of its time in office. Of course, you'll remember that 12 days ahead of last year's budget that was presented in October, the Treasurer formally ditched that emphasis on running surpluses and eliminating net debt. And he said at the time, you'll recall, that the government wouldn't turn to the task of discretionary budget repair until the unemployment rate was comfortably below 6%. And to be fair to him, of course, the budget he brought down 12 days later said that the unemployment rate wouldn't be below 6% until the middle of 2024. So that appeared to be, at the time, a reasonably demanding threshold. Of course, as we know now, in May 2021, the unemployment rate is already, I would say, comfortably below 6%, but the Treasurer said that's still not good enough to begin the task of discretionary budget repair. It's now the government's objective to get the unemployment rate below 5% and to see it sustained at those lower levels. And in making that speech, the Treasurer explicitly ruled out what he described as any sharp pivots towards austerity. Now, undoubtedly, political considerations have played a role in that conclusion. Almost certainly, there will be an election before the end of May next year. I think the last date on which an election can be held in order to meet the constitutional requirement that new senators can take their places on the 1st of July next year is about the 21st or 22nd of May. So this could well be the last budget before the next election, although it's also possible that the government could do what it did in 2019 and pull the budget forward towards April. But although it's politically expedient for the government to avoid cutting spending and raising taxes. Indeed, on the contrary, to have some big spending and some more tax cuts in what might well be a pre-election budget. The fact that it's politically convenient or expedient doesn't always mean that it's wrong from an economic policy perspective. Indeed, I'd say that the change to the government's fiscal strategy that the Treasurer has enunciated and put into place in this budget is, as Alfred P. Doolittle said in My Fair Lady, the right and proper thing to do from the standpoint of good economic policy. And I say that because what it means in practice is that for the next year at least, fiscal and monetary policy will be working in harmony towards a common goal, that of lower unemployment, rather than being at cross purposes as they have been for most of the last 20 years. Between 2001 and 2008, you had the Reserve Bank gradually tightening monetary policy and the federal government thwarting the intention of that by giving repeated rounds of large personal income tax cuts and regular cash bonuses paid to pensioners and others. And that continued into the first year of the Rudd government. And then once the coalition came to office in 2013, for the next 6 years, it tightened fiscal policy in pursuit of a budget surplus, whilst the Reserve Bank was intermittently loosening monetary policy. And with the benefit of hindsight, it's understandable that that's why the economy stagnated in the aftermath of the peak of the mining boom. We struggled to get economic growth much above 2% per annum. The unemployment rate got stuck at about 5.25% per annum. Wages growth continued to decline, and the Reserve Bank undershot its inflation target for what turned out to be 5 years in a row. But now we've got both the budget and the Reserve Bank pointing in the same direction, and I think it makes it much more likely that that common goal will be achieved than was the case when fiscal and monetary policy were pointing in opposite directions. When we look at the budget numbers themselves, we see, and this is one of the things the government wanted people to focus on, that the budget deficit for the 2021 financial year that's about to end will be a lot smaller than had been forecast in the budget in October last year, when it was going to be 214 billion, or indeed a lot smaller than was forecast in MyEFO, which was, from memory, about 194 billion. So the deficit for 2021 has been revised down by 53 billion, but you'll see that the reduction in the deficit compared with previous forecast for 2021-22 is only 5 billion. And this is a surprise, the deficits for 2022-23 and 2023-24 have actually been revised upwards by an average of $12 billion per annum. And of course, there will still be quite a significant deficit of over 50 billion in the 2024-25 financial year. Now, those large deficits aren't sufficiently larger to prevent downward revisions to the level of net debt that's forecast compared with what had been forecast in last year's budget or in the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, largely because of the more than $50 billion reduction in the government's borrowing for the current financial year. The government can afford to run bigger budget deficits in 2 of the 4 years of the forward estimates period and still forecast less net debt than it had been in last year's budget. The forecast for net debt in 30 June 2024 has been revised down by 46 billion, which you'll note is just slightly less than the downward revision to the budget deficit that's forecast for the financial year that's about to end. As I said, quite consciously, the government has kicked the budget repair can down the road, presumably until after the next election. And these charts show the medium-term forecasts out to the 31-32 financial year, and you can see that there's been almost no change to the profile of the budget deficit over the medium term, and that the decline in net debt beyond the peak in about 2026-27 isn't appreciably greater than had been forecast in last year's 2021 budget. But the government can afford to do that. It can afford to postpone the task of budget repair, partly because, as these charts that are taken from the IMF's Fiscal Monitor published in early April show, Australia's public finances are, for the most part, in better shape than those of broadly comparable countries, even though we ran bigger budget deficits than most of them during the most recent recession. Although New Zealand and Canada have, according to this table, lower levels of public debt as a proportion of GDP than we're going to have, we're in much better shape than the UK and the US, and of course, much better shape than advanced economies as a group, which include not only countries with even lower levels of public debt, like the Nordic countries, but also a range of countries in continental Europe and, of course, Japan that have substantially higher levels of public debt, even than the United Kingdom or the United States. And the government's having absolutely no difficulty borrowing in order to finance the deficit it's run. As I note here, since the onset of the pandemic, the government has received offers for almost 4 times as much debt as it's actually needed to borrow at interest rates that are only imperceptibly higher than the rates it's had to pay on the bonds it's wanted to sell. So there's no real lack of willingness on the part of the financial markets to lend the Australian government whatever it feels it needs to borrow. And then the other important point, of course, is that because interest rates are so low and likely to remain low for a considerable period of time into the future, that the government can service the elevated levels of debt it's racking up while still spending a smaller percentage of GDP or its own revenue, or a smaller amount per head in real terms on interest payments than it has done for most of the last 50 years, except for the period towards the end of the previous decade when net debt had fallen to extremely low levels. All of that said, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this budget does actually increase the structural deficit in the next 2 fiscal years, that is the one beginning on 1st of July and the following one, and that it will still be in structural deficit to the tune of more than 1 percentage point of GDP in 10 years' time. As the left-hand chart here shows, in 10 years' time, payments or outlays as a proportion of GDP will still be 1.75 percentage points higher than the average for the 20 years prior to the pandemic, while revenues or receipts will still be 0.25 percentage point lower by 2031-32 than they have been on average over the 20 years prior to the onset of the pandemic. And as this chart that's taken from the budget paper shows, the structural budget, that is, stripped of the impact of cyclical fluctuations on revenues, of movements in the economy or in asset or commodity prices. And I draw your particular attention to the fact that the budget deficit, the structural budget deficit, that is, which in this definition excludes the temporary fiscal supports that were provided during the pandemic last year and the early part of this year. If you take those out, the structural budget deficit is forecast to rise from about 1.25 percentage points of GDP in the year that's about to end to, as you can see now, more than 3 percentage points of GDP in the following 3 financial years. And that's an indication of the extent to which, once you strip out the impact of the strengthening economy and the tapering of the measures that were introduced in a temporary way last year, this year's budget is adding to rather than subtracting from the budget, the structural position. Now, again, to emphasize, I'm not criticizing that. I think it's the right thing to do in current circumstances, but there will come a time, probably in the life of the next parliament, when the right thing to do is to reverse some of the structural deterioration in the budget position that has been an appropriate policy response to the circumstances of today. So when we now turn our attention in more detail to what the government actually did in putting this budget together, we find ourselves looking at what the budget papers call parameter variations on the one hand and policy decisions on the other. And let me be clear what those terms mean. It's important to remember, as economists are always aware, that while the newspapers and the politicians focus on the impact that the budget has on the economy, through the decisions which the government makes to alter the levels of spending and revenues, the economy also has a pretty significant impact on the budget via the impact that, for example, stronger employment growth has on personal income tax collections and spending on unemployment benefits, or that higher corporate profits, whether they're due to higher iron ore prices or any other factor, has on the amount of company tax that's paid. The budget papers refer to those latter effects, that is, the impact on the budget bottom line of things that are beyond the direct control of the government, but are rather the result of changes in economic assumptions or changes in the take-up rates of various government programs that happen because of behavioural changes on the part of the public. They call them parameter variations. And as you can see from this chart, the impact of parameter variations since December's mid-year outlook has been to improve the budget's bottom line over the 5 years to 2024-25 by a total of more than $100 billion. In other words, if nothing else had happened, the government would have been able to reduce the budget deficits in prospect over the 4 years to 2024-25 by more than $100 billion. But in fact, what the government has done has been to allocate more than 90%, or $96 billion of those windfall gains from, for the most part, increased tax revenue on the back of a stronger economy, to policy decisions to increase spending by about $68 billion over the 5 years of the forward estimates period, or cut revenues, cut taxes by $28 billion over the 5 years to 2024-25. And in particular, for the 2 years I mentioned, 2022-23 and 2023-24, the policy decisions taken in this budget context more than outweighed the impact of favourable parameter variations in reducing the budget deficits that had been forecast back in December. Now, this table's very complicated, and I'm not going to go through all of the numbers in it, but it serves to highlight where what the government has done in those policy decisions that I referred to. You can see in particular that 4 groups of measures account for half of the policy decisions that were announced in the budget, or in practice leaked to the press in the days leading up to the budget. And those are, first of all, the extension of the instant asset write-off, or the temporary expensing of investment expenditures, as the Treasurer calls it. The second biggest program was the $17 billion or so increase in spending on aged care programs. The third, which I've grouped together, are programs designed to benefit unemployed people, in particular the job trainer program and other training programs for people who find themselves unemployed, as well as the cost of the budget of the increase in the underlying rate of job seeker payment that the government eventually decided on earlier this year. And then the fourth biggest expenditure or policy decision was the raft of road and other infrastructure programs that were announced in budget night, although again most of those had been leaked to the newspapers in the days leading up to the budget. Just a couple of other ones that are worth noting, and I'll say a bit more about these in a moment, the extension of the low and middle income tax offset for another year was a reasonably expensive decision. The government's put plenty of money into aviation and tourism. Importantly, the government has made some substantial commitments to improving funding for mental health programs. And as expected, the government is spending more on what it calls women's economic security in the light of all the political difficulties the government had encountered earlier this year that have been very widely reported. Just looking at the tax measures in a little bit more detail, as I've mentioned, the biggest single measure in the budget, as it was in last year's, was the extension for another year of the instant asset write-off for expenses, investment by small businesses, that is those with an annual turnover of less than 5 million, for another 12 months. That's going to cost $18 billion over the 4 years of the forward estimates period, although because in effect it amounts to a bring forward of depreciation claims that would otherwise have been made over the life of the assets concerned, a significant chunk of that cost will be clawed back over the period beyond the end of 2024-25. Another fairly significant tax provision was the extension of the temporary loss carryback provision that was introduced last year. That allows, again, only small businesses to use the losses that they are currently incurring to in effect get a refund of tax they've paid on profits that they might have made back as far as 2018-19. That program was due to expire in the current financial year, but it's going to be extended for another financial year at a cost of $2.25 billion. Some of that, again, will be recouped by there being fewer losses available to offset future profits over the medium term. The other big tax cut was the extension of what I heard the Treasurer call the limto. My understanding is that people in policy circles in Canberra call it the Lamington. That's the low and middle income tax offset that was part of the first tranche of the government's three-stage tax cut program introduced in the 2019 budget that provides a rebate of up to $1,080 for people with incomes of between $48,000 and $90,000 per annum, although you can earn up to $126,000 per annum and still get something back from the Lamington. That was extended for another year last year, and it's been extended for another year again in 2022-23. And I suspect the reason they've done that is because if they hadn't, then people who benefited from it, and that's a big slice of the electorate, would have faced a $20 a week or $1,080 increase in their tax burden in the lead up to the next election, which I'm sure the government would have regarded as unhelpful. Another notable tax policy change was the decision to remove the requirement that people who've received shares under employee share schemes start paying tax on them when they leave that employer who's provided them. Now, people who depart companies with shares intact will be able to defer the tax on them for up to 15 years. The government portrays that as a spur to entrepreneurship, although I suspect the biggest beneficiaries of it will be CEOs of very large companies. The final thing I wanted to mention, and this is a measure I really approve of, is the decision in the budget to introduce what the Treasurer calls a patent tax box system, which provides that a company who generates taxable income from medical or biotech patents lodged in Australia, and they foreshadow that this might also extend to clean energy patents, will be taxed at a rate of 17% rather than 25% if they're a small business or 30% if they're a larger one. That's a small measure. It's only going to cost $100 million a year. But in my view, it gives effect to something I've been arguing for a long time, which is that instead of preferencing small businesses simply because they're small, the government should instead give tax preferences to new businesses, because new businesses are much more likely to create jobs and to innovate and do other things that supposedly the government wants businesses to do. But because there are far fewer new businesses than there are small ones, any such concessions would cost a lot less than the concessions the government has introduced to small businesses, and they could afford to be a lot more generous. You could, for example, say that any new business pays company tax at the rate of 10 or 15% for the first 5 years that it starts making a profit. And that would be a much more powerful incentive, in my view, to entrepreneurship than just giving every corner store and every tradie and every other small business that self-incorporates a 5 percentage point reduction in their tax rate. You know, the Treasurer again repeated the shibboleth in the budget last night, the small business is the engine room of the economy. And with all due respect to the Treasurer, I have to say there's absolutely no evidence for that at all. Indeed, the surveys that the ABS has been taking through the pandemic tell us that it's medium and large businesses who are going to be the engine rooms of both job creation and investment as we emerge from the most recent recession, not small businesses at whose altar the government seems obliged to genuflect. If we look back over a longer period, while it's true that small business accounts for a bit over 40% of private sector employment, according to ABS statistics. What those who genuflect at the altar of small business neglect to tell you, indeed they may not even know, is that 15 years ago, small business employed over 50% of the private sector workforce. And while there are plenty of small businesses that have created jobs over the intervening period, in aggregate, over that period, small business hasn't created a single job. It's been a small net job destroyer. All of the growth in private sector employment over the past 5 years in particular has come from medium and large businesses, businesses which incidentally typically have to pay payroll tax, which underscores the fact that the generous payroll tax exemptions and concessions that state and territory governments give to small business don't do anything to create employment at all. Nor is there any truth in the assertion that small businesses are more innovative than their larger counterparts. Indeed, these figures from the ABS show that small businesses are less likely than medium or large ones to engage in any of the forms of innovation that the ABS recognises in its surveys of these things. What small business is really good at is not paying the tax that they're meant to. The Tax Gap project that the ATO runs, to which I'm an outside advisor, which seeks to estimate the difference between what the ATO actually collects under various heads of revenue and what they would collect given full compliance, as the ATO defines it, with the tax law, that non-compliance by small business accounts for 47% of the estimated gap in personal and company income tax collections, in marked contrast to the popular perception that it's big companies, especially banks and multinationals, and rich individuals and families who aren't paying their so-called fair share. In fact, ATO figures show that large corporates pay more than 90% of the tax that the ATO thinks they should, and high net worth individuals also pay more than 90% of the tax which the ATO thinks that they should. And after their enforcement activities, they pay an even greater proportion, whereas small business only pays about 87% of the tax which the ATO thinks that it should. And what's small businesses' outcome for that greater extent of not paying their fair share of tax? Well, not only do they legitimately get to pay 5 percentage points less by way of company tax on any given amount of income, but now as a result of this budget, they're getting extra protection from efforts by the ATO to make them pay the tax that they should pay. And that seems to me to be entirely misplaced. Let me turn to another area of the budget of which I would be more critical. The government had a number of measures that were designed, so the Treasurer said, to promote home ownership. One of them that I think is understandable is the provision of almost $750 million to extend the period in which people who've got the home builder grant for building new homes as first home buyers, that's been extended from 6 months to 18 months. That's understandable because we know that there are now some lengthy backlogs in the home building industry that are preventing work being started according to the schedules that people might have expected when they entered into those contracts. So although I'm a critic of first home builder grants in general, it would be wrong to take those grants away from people who've entered into contracts in good faith just because their builders are slow. But it also contains 3 other measures of which I'm far more critical. The first of those is the decision to increase from 30,000 to 50,000 the amount that people can take out of their superannuation funds if they've been voluntary or non-concessional contributions to super in order to put together a deposit on a first home. The second is the extension of the so-called first home loan deposit scheme that allows people to borrow in order to purchase a first home with a deposit of 5%, with the government guaranteeing whatever is required to bring that up to 20% of the purchase price. That's going to be extended to allow another 10,000 applicants to access it in 2021-22. And then, as leaked to the media beforehand, the government's introduced a new scheme to allow up to 10,000 single parents to purchase a home with a deposit of as little as 2%, with the government again guaranteeing whatever's required to bring the deposit up to 20% of the purchase price. Now, those measures will benefit what's a relatively small number of people in the grand scheme of things who can get to the front of the queue for them. But you'd like to think, I'd think, that by now the governments would have realised that schemes like this, which allow people intending to buy homes to pay more for those homes than they otherwise would, only ever result in more expensive housing rather than in higher home ownership rates. I mean, we've been doing this since the early 1960s when John Howard, as president of the New South Wales Young Liberals, managed to convince Bob Menzies, who was Prime Minister at the time, that the government ought to introduce what we now know as the First Home Owners Grant. And that was in 1964. The home ownership rate peaked at just over 72% in the 1966 census. Since then, we've seen the ratio of house prices across Australia to average earnings rise from the roughly 3 times that it had been between the late 1940s and the late 1970s to over 7 times average earnings in Sydney and to about 5 to 5.5 times in most other Australian capital cities, whilst the home ownership rate has fallen steadily to what at the 2016 census was the lowest it had been since the census of 1954. And I would bet that when the 2021 census results are released around this time next year, the home ownership rate will have fallen even further. But unfortunately, we keep doing these things. It kind of reminds you of Albert Einstein's definition of insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. The other thing you'd like to think that governments would have learned is from the US experience in the years before the financial crisis that getting people into home ownership on very high initial loan to valuation ratios isn't such a good idea for those folks themselves, and it's not all that good for the financial system in the event that house prices start to go southwards again. The problem, I think, is that politicians know all too well that the number of people who benefit from continually escalating house prices, that's the in excess of 11 million Australians who own at least one property, and there are more than 2 million Australians who own 2 or more properties. That vastly outnumbers the number of people who are trying to buy a home for the first time, of whom typically there are about 100,000 in any given year. And even the dumbest of our politicians, and there's a fair few of them, can work out that particular piece of arithmetic. Sadly, there's nothing in the budget that increases the supply of housing, especially the supply of affordable rental housing. And in my view, the solution to the home ownership problems we have, and for that matter, the rental affordability problems that we have, is to be found much more in measures that increase the supply of housing rather than in measures that inflate the demand for it, which is what politicians usually resort to. One final issue that I wanted to address in the budget that, to the best of my knowledge, hasn't attracted any attention at all, is the escalating cost of assuaging Western Australia's grievances over the way in which GST revenues are carved up among the states and territories. Those who follow these things closely, and there aren't really all that many of you, will remember that in 2018, the Morrison Government, in response to sustained pressure from Western Australia over more than 10 years, imposed some significant changes in the way that the GST revenue is carved up among the states and territories. Instead of being distributed, as they had been since the early 1980s, among states and territories so as to enable them to provide the same range of and standard of services to their citizens as the richest state could, and in recent years, that's been Western Australia, GST revenues were to be distributed in order to raise the fiscal capacity of states and territories to the stronger of New South Wales or Victoria. And in addition, from 2022-23, the government dictated that no state would get less than 70%, or from 2024-25, 75% of what it would have received under a notional equal per capita distribution of GST revenues. And the only state which had been receiving less than 70% of an equal per capita share in recent years had been Western Australia. So those changes are being phased in from 2021-22. Those changes mean that when the iron ore price is above about $70 to $75 a tonne, Western Australia will get a larger share of the GST revenue than it would have done if the arrangements that applied up to the current financial year had remained in force. Or in practice, what that means is that Western Australia gets to keep a larger share of its now enormous mineral royalty revenue windfalls than it would have done. And it's worth noting that because in effect Western Australia has been excluded from the possibility of being regarded as the richest state for these purposes, that if by some quirk of geography, the iron ore deposits that have made Western Australia so wealthy had instead been at Broken Hill rather than in the Pilbara, New South Wales would not have benefited from these changes because New South Wales is still a benchmark state, whereas Western Australia has been excluded from that. Now, remember that the GST revenue sharing arrangements are a zero-sum game. That is, one state only improves its position at the expense of other states and territories. Because these changes are so large, the Morrison government agreed as a transitional measure to top up the GST pool so that no other state or territory would be worse off than they would have been had the changes not been made. And that transitional guarantee applies up until the 2026-27 financial year. When that deal was made in 2018, the assumption was that the iron ore price would be $50 a tonne or thereabouts by now and forever afterwards. But as we know, the opposite has happened. The iron ore price is up to a record high of in excess of $200 a tonne. And what that's meant is that the cost of this transitional guarantee to the states and territories that Western Australia can get more money but that they won't get less has escalated by 33%. Or more than $1.75 billion merely since December last year, as a result of the constraints that have been built into the system to favour Western Australia becoming binding rather than notional. What this amounts to is that the federal government will be adding $7.5 billion to its own already very large deficits over the next 24 years to 24-25, so that Western Australia, which is the only government in the country that's running budget surpluses, and I would guess one of the very few governments anywhere in the world that's running budget surpluses, can get $7.5 billion more of GST revenues than it would have done otherwise. And frankly, I think that's outrageous, not just because I'm a Tasmanian and Tasmania benefits from the GST, but if I were the Treasurer of New South Wales or any other state or territory, I'd be appalled and asking for this deal to be revisited because it just simply doesn't make sense for the federal government to be borrowing more money so that a state that's already running budget surpluses can end up running even bigger ones. Well, that's the end of that particular rant. Let me summarise what I think are the key takeaways of this budget. First, the economy has done better than it had been expected to do at the time of last year's budget and at the time of the mid-year review in December. It's also done better than most other advanced economies since the onset of COVID-19. And the two reasons for that are that we've done better at keeping the virus at bay, and we've done more to support households and businesses through the downturn than most other countries. One risk to that situation continuing is sluggishness in getting a significant enough proportion of our population vaccinated. To be fair to the government, it does include more than $1 billion of extra spending to get more doses of the vaccine available to the Australian population. And let's hope that gets us back on track with a reasonable vaccine rollout. Otherwise, our position at the forefront of nations in terms of economic performance coming out of COVID-19 might not be sustained. The government's decision to deter the task of discretionary budget repair for at least another year is certainly politically convenient for them, but that of itself doesn't make it wrong. On the contrary, as I said, I think it is the right and proper thing to do. It means that both major elements of economic policy are going to be working in harmony towards a common goal, a widely shared goal of the lowest unemployment rate we've had for any length of time in more than or in almost 50 years, rather than working at cross purposes as monetary and fiscal policy so often have done over the last 2 decades. Many of the forecasts that the government has made with regard to economic and employment growth are conservative, and it's possible that we could see better outcomes than those forecasts, although it's perhaps less assured that if that is the case, it will in turn translate into higher wage and price inflation, which is what we really want to do. Be all that as it may, ultimately, whoever's in government, presumably after the next election, will need to start making some politically challenging decisions about spending or revenues so that we can be in a position to do what we've done over the last 12 months again, if the circumstances turn out to require it. This year's budget has benefited significantly from that earlier and stronger than expected recovery in Australia's economy and in employment. But rather than direct that towards a faster reduction in the deficit, the government's chosen, as I say, I think for the most part rightly, to direct nearly all of those windfall revenue gains to increased spending or to tax cuts. This budget consciously increases the structural deficit for 2 of the 4 years of the forward estimates period. The tax cuts that account for about a third of those policy decisions are for the most part short-term fixes, extensions of what were designed initially to be temporary measures rather than genuine reforms or lasting cuts in tax. Of course, to be fair to the government, they'd say that that comes in the form of the third tranche of their 3-stage tax cut program that begins on the 1st of July 2024. In my view, the housing-related measures in the budget won't do anything to increase home ownership, but will instead add further to upward pressure on house prices, of which we're already seeing plenty at the moment. The only defence that I think the government can have is that what they're doing is pretty small and is only going to add to upward pressure on prices at the margin. I think the government's confidence in small business as the engine room of the economy is totally misplaced. The government would get far more bang for the buck it allocates to concessions to small business if instead of giving them to businesses simply because they're small and for no other reason at all, it gave them to businesses which are new, as they've done in a very small way with the reduction in the company tax rate for company income that's generated from biotech or medical patents that are lodged in Australia. That's a good template for what they should be doing on a broader scale. But I don't think the concessions that the government's giving or extending to small business are money well spent or money that is spent effectively. And finally, I think the government's generosity to Western Australia, increasing its own deficit in order to boost their surpluses, is really quite scandalous, and representatives from the eastern states and the leaders and treasurers of state and territory governments in the eastern states ought to be far more vocal about that than they have been. And maybe when they realise what's going on, perhaps they will. So thank you very much for listening to that discussion of the 2021 budget and the context in which it was brought down. I think there's time for some questions if people have any, so I will now stop sharing my screen. And if people either want to ask questions, if they can unmute themselves or put them through the chat, then I'd be happy to do my best to answer them. So I note it has just gone 4 o'clock, so understand if people have to leave. But if there are any questions, please feel free to put them. Or, as I've said there, you can, yes, someone, Alex asks, many have described what the coalition handed down as a Labor budget and a pre-election budget. How do I think Albanese should best respond? I think that's tomorrow night rather than tonight. It would seem as though both Jim Chalmers, the Shadow Treasurer, and Anthony Albanese, the opposition leader, are caught a bit in a dilemma between wanting to, and I can understand why they feel chafed that if they'd been doing these things as a Labor government, the coalition would have been doing, with the support of many parts of the media, what they did when Labor was in government last, demonising debt and deficits and talking about what a dreadful legacy we're leaving to our grandchildren and all of that sort of thing. I suspect, as I saw one of the left-leaning think tanks say to the Labor Party, look, the coalition has got over its debt and deficit hang-ups, the Labor Party needs to as well. And I think the Labor Party would probably be better advised if they focused on critiquing the quality of the spending and taxation decisions that were in this budget rather than trying to base their attack on the quantity of them. And if they were, for example, to cast doubt on some of the spending or tax decisions in the way that I've done, that might provide a more fruitful line of attack than just simply criticising the coalition for hypocrisy. I mean, the coalition is not going to lose any votes because they have eschewed the option of cutting spending or raising taxes in the next 12 months. And I think the Labor Party will have to be more creative than that if they're to cut through with the people they need to cut through in between now and the next election. Now, Rod is asking from Launceston, is asking, was there any change in environment spending? And I didn't pay close attention to that, Rod, but I don't think that there was anything particularly significant in that space. From memory, the government was providing some incentives for gas users to become, I think the phrase was hydrogen ready. And I mentioned in passing that the government was going to consider allowing clean energy project patents also to take advantage of the concessional tax rate that will apply to medical and biotech patents, patents, but I don't recall seeing anything of a significant scale in relation to the environment in the budget. Are there any more questions? I'm not sure whether there are. Let me just put back on the screen, if I can bring the share screen just back, that if anyone's interested in getting a copy of these slides, we're going to put them up on my website. There's the address there. Can I also invite you, if you're interested, to consider subscribing to the chart pack we put out every Saturday night that tracks the course of the virus and policy responses to it, and economic developments in the major global economies, the US, Europe, Japan, and China, Asia, excluding Japan and China, Australia, of course, and New Zealand. If you're interested in that, you can get access to that at what we think is a very reasonable price. Can I just, before we leave, just stop that and hand over to my colleague Rati Lahore, who just wants to say a few things by rounding up and about how we're going to follow up this seminar. So Rati, over to you.
Oh, so before we do that, there is a question from Adam Siddiq in the Q&A panel. So
right, okay, I can see one from Michael Pascoe, which I'll answer in a moment, but I don't see the one from Adam there.
If you click down the bottom where Q&A is, can you see there's a Q&A? I'll copy and paste the question for you.
Yes, I can. Okay, well, sorry, I'll come to that in a minute. Let me just look at Michael's question there, where he asked, while the government is spending, its contribution to the government economy will still be 3% smaller than the new financial year. Is that a fiscal contraction? Yes, in one sense, Michael, I guess it is, but it's one that was well telegraphed, and more than half of it comes from the termination of the JobKeeper scheme at the end of March, and it does seem to be pretty clear, both from the payroll jobs figures that were released on Monday of this week for the 4 weeks of April, and from the bi-weekly numbers that the Department of Social Services is now providing to a Senate Select Committee that's overviewing the government's response to COVID on the number of people receiving unemployment benefits, I was going to say job seeker and youth allowance other benefits. It would seem fairly clear that there hasn't been a significant wave of job losses. Indeed, the number of people on those benefits has declined by, I think, more than 40,000 since the end of JobKeeper. And the Treasury's estimates that the end of JobKeeper could be associated with a loss of between 100 and 150,000, which if true would boost the unemployment rate by 0.7 to 1 percentage point. Those estimates look to have been too pessimistic. So, I mean, yes, in one sense, the expiry of the measures that were always going to expire represents a fiscal contraction of sorts. But I'd say that the new spending and tax measures that are in the budget will at least offset that. Here's the one from Adam. Am I concerned by the potential missed opportunity to fund structural reform to bring back incentives for payments to states? At one level, yes, I am, Adam. I think the states should be doing this on their own. You know, the potential benefits from replacing stamp duty on property transfers with a more broadly based land tax have been well enough documented over an incredibly long period of time that states ought to be willing to do this for the benefits to themselves without needing an additional handout from the federal government. And of course, that's what the New South Wales government is proposing to do. And I commend them for that, although I think they're going about the transition in the wrong way by, in effect, making it optional as to whether you move into the new system or not. It is true, of course, that transitional arrangements, the desire to avoid taxing twice people who have recently purchased properties, does create a revenue hole for governments, and the federal government could certainly help speed up that process or grease the wheels of reform if it were to provide some assistance, which it can do at very low interest rates to states to smooth that over. That would be better, I think, than some of the other things that they're proposing to do, including, for example, that $7.5 billion that they're giving to Western Australia indirectly, would be a better use of that money. When it comes to payroll tax, again, my view is that the state government should scrap nearly all of their concessions or exemptions to small business with regard to payroll tax and hand over the collection of payroll tax to the ATO, which would be a very simple matter. And, you know, we don't exempt small businesses from deducting PAYG installments or compulsory super contributions just because a business is small. It would be a pretty simple matter for them to handle payroll tax, and then state government should give much more generous concessions for payroll tax to new businesses in the same way that I argue that the federal government should do with respect to company tax. So yes, I would love to see the federal government do it. I had zero expectation that they would do it in this budget, and not a particularly high expectation that they're going to do it anytime soon. But again, to come back to the question that Alex asked, maybe that's something that the Labor Party could pursue if it wanted to, either, if not in its address in reply on Thursday night, maybe at some point between now and the next election. Are there any more, Rati?
No? That's all the question I have, but maybe there's more question from the audience. Okay.
No, it doesn't seem so. So you were just going to wrap up there, Rati.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for being here today and for joining us in this presentation. We look forward to see you again in our future presentation. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel so you know our updates, and also subscribe to the website. Thank you. Thank you, Saul, for a lovely presentation.
Thank you, Rati, and thank you everyone for being here for an hour. There's a lot of things that are on the day after the budget, so it's really kind of you to spend an hour with us. Thank you, and look forward to seeing some, if not all of you, and maybe even some of your friends and colleagues the next time we have one of these. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you.